In 1991, the small Arab state of Kuwait was at the center of the last major war of the 20th century. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had invaded Kuwait, putting nearly half the world's oil within his reach.
Virtually everyone agreed he had to be stopped.
Over 1 million troops faced each other across the battlefield.
Revolutionary new technology like stealth bombers, cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs would make this a battle unlike anything anyone had seen before.
I'll be getting to grips with some of the challenges faced by the men and women on the front line in this new era of warfare.
And I'll show how the commanders chose their tactics in a war dominated by cutting-edge technology and ruthless political calculation.
With his seizure of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein threatened to hold the whole world to ransom. He warned that the fight that would follow would be the mother of all battles. Everything would now depend on the outcome of Operation Desert Storm.
In the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraq's army shocked the world by invading its neighbor, Kuwait.
They smashed through the defenses on the border and headed straight down this road towards the capital, Kuwait City. Kuwait's tiny army was unable to mount any serious resistance.
Thousands of Iraqi troops were soon swarming through the capital.
At around 4:30 a.m., just hours after the start of the invasion, Iraqi troops arrived here at the Parliament building. The guards were taken completely by surprise, and within minutes, Kuwait's parliament had been captured.
The ruler of Kuwait, the emir, along with most of the royal princes, abandoned their palaces and fled. By the end of the day, the entire country of Kuwait was completely overrun, as thousands of Iraqi troops continued to pour across the border. And they were all obeying the orders of one man, Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq and a brutal dictator. For 11 years, he had enforced a violent regime that murdered and tortured without hesitation. He'd built up the fourth largest army in the world, with over 1 million troops. But his regime was in serious trouble. Not least because an 8-year war with his neighbor Iran had left him with a mountain of debt.
Iraq was bankrupt. Saddam had to come up with a solution to his cash crisis, and it lay across the border here in Kuwait. This is Iraq, and here is Kuwait. Kuwait is almost floating on oil. Outside the capital, Kuwait City, oil wells cover much of the country. To the north, there are oil fields on the border with Iraq. Here in the center, the Burgan oil field is the second largest in the world. Altogether, Kuwait held 10% of the world's oil, and it was this vast wealth that Saddam had captured. Together with the Iraqi oil fields that Saddam already owned, he now had control of over 1/5 of the world's oil reserves. Saddam gambled that Western leaders did not have the stomach for a Middle East war, and would have to accept his occupation of Kuwait. But he was in for a rude shock.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
What has happened is a total violation of international law.
Please raise their hand.
The United Nations condemned the invasion and called on Saddam to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. But far from withdrawing, there were signs that he might be planning something even bigger. Thousands of Iraqi reinforcements were moving into Kuwait. Some set up defensive positions along the coastline. But most worrying for global leaders was the large number of troops and tanks driving right down through the country and massing on its southern border. The question was, would they stop there? 200 miles south of the border was the richest concentration of oil wells in the world. The oil fields of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi army was small. If Saddam chose to attack now, there was nothing to stop him. If he seized Saudi Arabia's wells, he would control nearly half the world's oil. President Bush Sr. and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were determined to stop him. They were convinced that the only way to protect Saudi Arabia and its oil was to put US and British troops in on the ground. But there was a huge problem.
Saudi Arabia is the spiritual home of Islam. It contains the cities of Mecca and Medina, the most holy sites in the Muslim world.
Its royal family ran the country according to strict Islamic laws. Any attempt to fly in tens of thousands of troops from the non-Muslim armies of Britain and America was a political minefield.
On August the 6th, 1990, just 4 days after Iraq had invaded Kuwait, a top-rank White House team flew to Saudi Arabia to meet King Fahd. They offered to fly in thousands of US troops to defend the kingdom.
King Fahd knew his meager forces couldn't stop Saddam Hussein if he chose to invade. And so, despite the risk of huge anger from devout Muslims, he immediately gave the Americans the invitation they wanted.
Within hours, one of the biggest deployments of troops since World War II was underway.
More than 250,000 American and British troops from bases in the US and Europe headed for the deserts of the Middle East. The Americans and British were determined that their stand against Saddam Hussein should be seen as an international operation and not as an American-led attack on an Arab country.
In the coming months, troops from over 30 countries would take their place alongside the Americans and British in the Saudi Arabian desert. It was an extraordinary coalition that even included several Arab states like Egypt and Syria, but it was the Americans that dominated.
The man in charge was called General Norman Schwarzkopf.
He was a giant of a man with a keen intellect. He also had a fiery temper, and he set the tone with one of his first public comments about Saddam Hussein.
If he dares come across that border and come down here, I'm completely confident that we're going to kick his butt when he gets here.
Schwarzkopf was a tough talker, but he knew he faced a mammoth task.
Many of the troops had been trained to go into battle on the green rolling hills of Europe. They arrived to find a scorched, barren desert like this one. It was a place few of them had ever imagined they'd have to fight over.
By November 1990, world leaders had run out of patience with Saddam. Although he hadn't attacked Saudi Arabia, he showed no signs of withdrawing from Kuwait. So the UN Security Council passed a new resolution that changed the coalition's mission dramatically.
12 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 1 abstention.
No longer would the coalition just defend Saudi Arabia. If Saddam's troops had not withdrawn from Kuwait in 6 weeks, the coalition would attack and force the Iraqis out.
The countdown to war had begun.
For the US military, it was a daunting prospect. They were haunted by the memories of the United States' last major conflict and knew that they could not afford to make the same mistakes again.
If one American soldier has to go into battle, that soldier will have enough force behind him to win and then get out as soon as possible. This will not be another Vietnam.
But Saddam was determined that that was exactly what it would be. He calculated that if the Americans attacked, his best hope was to inflict massive casualties on the US troops. Saddam believed that after the Vietnam War, it was not something the US public would tolerate. And in 1990, he had the weapons to cause thousands of casualties in seconds.
But in 1991, soldiers feared they really would have to fight while under chemical attack. Some of them were already suffering heat exhaustion just from wearing gas masks in training. Schwarzkopf knew that if it came to war, the greatest threat to his troops was Iraq's chemical weapons. And he also knew he would have to minimize American and coalition casualties. The key would be to keep his ground troops out of the battle for as long as possible.
Schwarzkopf's plan was to launch a colossal air attack on Iraq itself and on its forces on the ground, to try and force Saddam to abandon Kuwait. But if this didn't persuade Saddam to leave, Schwarzkopf knew that he would have to take a far more risky step. He'd have to order his forces to fight their way into Kuwait. And some of the experts predicted that this would cost thousands of American lives.
His strategy would call upon the full might of the United States Armed Forces.
More and more of the world's most sophisticated aircraft, tanks and weapons were arriving in the Gulf. And 6 American aircraft carriers with over 400 planes would be positioned within striking distance of Iraq and Kuwait.
One week before the UN deadline expired, 750,000 coalition troops waited on the battlefield, as the politicians made one last attempt to find a diplomatic solution. The US Secretary of State, James Baker, met Iraq's Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz, in Geneva. Both men knew that tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives were at stake. And James Baker warned the Iraqis not to use chemical weapons, reminding them that America had nuclear bombs. But 7 hours of talks ended in failure.
If Iraq should choose to continue its brutal occupation of Kuwait, Iraq will be choosing a military confrontation which it cannot win, and which will have devastating consequences.
But Saddam remained as defiant as ever and promised his people a great victory. He warned that the Americans depended too much on technology. He boasted that Iraq could rely on the bravery and experience of its soldiers. Their faith would defeat the enemy.
At midnight on January the 15th, 1991, the UN deadline expired. Across the world, people watched and waited. Everybody knew it was just a matter of time before the war began.
In the early hours of January the 17th, 1991, hundreds of coalition aircraft took to the skies and headed for their targets.
Operation Desert Storm had begun. British RAF pilots in low-flying Tornado aircraft carried bombs designed to crater Iraqi runways. The Americans' first target was Iraq's capital. From the rooftops of Baghdad, 3,000 anti-aircraft guns fired into the night.
Flying straight into this wall of fire were 8 American bombers.
The F-117 stealth bomber was designed to be invisible to radar. But this was its first test in major combat.
The stealth's first target was the main communications tower in Baghdad.
At exactly 3 a.m., the pilot in the lead aircraft pushed the button and a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb descended on its target. Across the city, the ground shook as 14 more bombs from other stealths hit their targets. The aircraft turned for home. Cruise missiles launched from US warships knocked out the power stations and plunged the city into darkness.
The air campaign, unleashed by the coalition against Saddam's Iraq, was codenamed Instant Thunder. It was the most powerful and focused use of air power in the 20th century.
On the first night, coalition aircraft flew over 1,000 sorties. They hit power stations, radar and communication networks, airfields, and chemical weapons facilities. The aim was first to gain control of the skies above Kuwait and Iraq and destroy Saddam's ability to coordinate his forces, and then to target the forces themselves.
That night and into the following day, American and coalition aircraft continued to attack Iraqi targets, including Saddam Hussein's palaces.
Saddam Hussein was in fear for his life. He moved between safe houses to avoid the coalition attacks, but in public he would not be cowed. On Baghdad radio, he declared that the mother of all battles had begun.
It was all part of the public relations war. After their experiences in Vietnam, American commanders knew that unfavorable coverage might damage public support for the war. So they carefully managed what was actually seen by the watching world.
Splash. That was an excellent splash.
The American general who commands all the Allied forces in the Gulf has said that Operation Desert Storm has been going according to plan.
The aim was to portray the war as...
But the laughter was about to end. In the early hours of February the 13th, 1991, 2 stealth bombers flew towards the Al Amariya bunker in the suburbs of Baghdad on what was supposed to be a routine mission. Shortly after 4:30 a.m., they released 2 laser-guided bombs.
Exactly as planned, the bombs dropped down a ventilation shaft and exploded deep inside the bunker to maximize destruction. The trouble was, It was packed with over 400 civilians. But the Iraqi army got no such reprieve. The air campaign had battered Iraqi targets for over a month, and still, Saddam had not withdrawn his army from Kuwait. Schwarzkopf knew coalition ground troops would soon have to drive them out, and in preparation, he intensified the airstrikes against the Iraqi front line. There was nothing smart about this bombardment. Old-fashioned planes, like the giant B-52s that had flown over Vietnam, dropped old-fashioned explosives and napalm on the Iraqi positions. When a canister of napalm hit the ground, it exploded in a mass of burning jelly, which incinerated anything it touched and sucked the air out of everyone's lungs within 50 meters. Coalition airmen flew around-the-clock bombing missions attempting to destroy 50% of the Iraqi armor.
We're trying to get ready for the ground troops to go in. So we're really trying to hit them hard in order to clear it out for the ground troops. We sent out 300 or 400, 500 bombs a day. Some of them weigh 1,000 pounds apiece, so it's unreal the tonnage going out here.
He ordered his troops inside Kuwait to counterattack against the US Marines. But they couldn't match the Americans' firepower, nor halt their relentless drive towards Kuwait City. However, Saddam still had one last sting in his tail. Iraqi troops fired a Scud missile towards a coalition base in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. The resulting explosion killed 28 Americans, and 100 were left wounded.
One of these ambulances has to go up there.
It was their biggest single loss in the war so far.
Nobody knows how many hundreds or thousands of Iraqis died in the attacks. The American leadership realized that pictures like these would soon be on television around the world, and they feared it would look like a massacre. This would become a key factor in deciding when to end the war.
With the liberation of Kuwait, the main political goal of the war had been achieved. But the Republican Guard had not yet been destroyed. However, President Bush feared that continuing to bomb a retreating enemy might give the impression that America was behaving like a bully. And so, on February the 28th, 1991, Bush declared a ceasefire.
I am pleased to announce that exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
The Gulf War was over.
Total 248 coalition troops were killed, far less than anyone had dared hope. Nobody knows how many Iraqis died, though some estimates put the figure at over 30,000, including 3,000 civilians. Despite the pre-war fears of the coalition, it had turned out to be one of the most one-sided battles in modern history.
Too weak to be a threat.
But Saddam's regime did not crumble as the Americans hoped. He crushed two uprisings that followed the end of the war and remained in power for another 12 years. Several thousand US forces remained in Saudi Arabia to keep watch on Saddam's army.